We are so honored that we have guests from very far UK. Our speaker today comes with group to do something with us, and so welcome to Yogyakarta. Welcome to our center, and also we have some guests over there. But just want to mention her, Mbak Sadia, our not all colleague, but our colleague from past and today. We have done something with her very much. Just to mention her, just to to recognize her presence here. So today, Professor James Walters is going to speak about a theme or a subject that we have been also actually engaging, religion and secularism. That is also a hot topic always here. We deal with just a little bit introduction about Indonesia, that we never be able to identify our our state status. Is it religious? Is it secular? Some say it is in between, but we never be able to define what it is. And I think British identity, nationhood, or secular religious exercise there could reflect also, I think. I mean, the way I say it reflects the way we also have dealt with that subject and issues. And we are so very thankful that Professor James Walters is willing to share with us the experience of British engagement to that subject. And the very title that we have here is British Religious Plurality in the Age of Today, Charles III. Started like last year, after he received the crown from the Elizabeth II. Okay, so another things in relation to this topic, the things we even discuss in our class is that the very term secularism, we learn it from European lands. I mean, we accept it, we study it, we know it, it's from European lands. And we have understood that the very strong holder of secularism is in Europe. And so British or UK is somewhat like a spot where we can see, or at least what we see, that facilitates religious exercise by the public. And so that gives us a sense how secularism is understood, is exercised there. Something unique in the term of Europe, in the context of European as a whole. And I think that is what we are going to hear, discuss with Professor Walters. Professor Walters, you have time about 40 minutes, 45 minutes to present your talk. And then after that, we will have discussion, exploration in relation to that. And I think we would share what we experience here, what we experience there, and what we can learn together for that. Times is yours. Good. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Well, it's a real delight to be in Yogyakarta, and over the next few days, as I get over my jet lag, I'm really looking forward to learning much more about this country, which I know very little about your religious diversity, your religious pluralism, and how it holds together. Particularly picking up on some of the themes that you introduced there, Professor. Thank you. On the nature of secularism and what it means to be in a society that's navigating religious diversity. But I thought it might be useful and interesting for me to speak to you this afternoon about the picture in the United Kingdom, about our religious diversity, about the kind of constitutional arrangements and cultural conditions that we have in place to hold that diversity together. In a world where, I'm sad to say, it seems that religious difference is increasingly problematic. So I'm going to sit down. I hope you can all see me if I do so. And we need to begin with some data. So every 10 years in the United Kingdom, we have a national census that gathers data from the residents of every household. And since 2001, there's been a voluntary and optional question about religious affiliation. So this means we now have 3 census returns giving us data about what the population of Britain believes. So the first was 2001, when we found that 72% of the population of England and Wales identified as Christian, 15% said they had no religion, and just under 6% said that they belonged to any other religion. 10 years later, 2011, Christians had dropped by 13% to 59%. Those saying they had no religion rose by an almost equivalent amount to 25%, and the minority religions rose to 8%, of which Islam now accounted for about half. So then last year, we got the data from the 2021 census. It takes them a little while to process it, and there was a big release day, and the big headline in the newspapers and in the media was that for the first time, less than half of the population of England and Wales identified as Christian. So going down to 46%. No religion rose to 37%. And also for the first time, the minority religions just nudged above the 10% mark to 11%, Islam being 7%. So you can see we've got these 2 main trends in UK religion. One is a shift from people in the left-hand column identifying as Christian towards the middle, saying that they're identifying as having no faith. The other trend is the growth in non-Christian religions. And I want to look at both of these trends this afternoon to frame our questions about how this religious plurality is held together in modern Britain. So first, we consider the shift in people identifying as Christian to saying that they have no faith. This is the issue that dominates the analysis of the census data because it's the phenomenon that has dominated Western academia's thinking about religion for the best part of a century. It's the phenomenon we call secularization. But secularization, as was pointed out in the introduction, can mean different things. And in the British context, I would say it means at least 2 things. The first is how, at an elite level, Western thinkers have pushed religion aside to make way for what they perceive as more rational, scientific ways of interpreting the world. And this is a very long story. As a central thinker of the Enlightenment, Sir Isaac Newton set in train a more mechanistic worldview in which knowledge can be pursued and the world can be explained without any metaphysical reference. Now, Newton retained a conception of God known as deism, in which God is the architect of this big cosmic machine set in motion at the point of creation, but unsustained by divine providence. And for Newton, this at least left the Bible as a source of morality and fruitful study. But by the time Napoleon came to ask the French physicist Pierre-Simon Laplace why, unlike Newton, his works did not refer to God, he replied, "Sire, I have no need of that hypothesis." And so the great Western figures of modernity like Marx and Freud and Nietzsche all sought to move on from religious worldviews, which they perceived as primitive and childish or oppressive of human thought and freedom. And this is the tradition, the intellectual tradition, that has formed the modern education system, with assumptions that the American scholar Jose Casanova has described as the knowledge regime of secularism, learning that is not seeking any transcendent reference point. Intellectuals are still inclined to think about secularism principally in these terms, and that's because it's fundamentally an intellectual argument and they're intellectuals. But the second thing this main census trend reflects is not an intellectual, but a much more popular level, a cultural disconnection from the temporal and spatial patternings of institutional Christianity. And this image is obviously of a regular parish church within the Church of England, typically a historic building, probably built in the Middle Ages. But this is increasingly not so typical because, as you can see, it's rather full. But we're seeing this cultural disconnection taking place. My grandparents' generation would have said they were Christian. And that was not necessarily because they were firm believers. They might not even have been regular participants in worship. Church attendance in 1980 was already below 10% in England. But rather, their cultural references would have been predominantly Christian. They will have sung hymns and been led in prayers every morning in school. This is a kind of typical image from a British school assembly, where schools are still required by law to have a daily act of collective worship that is broadly or wholly Christian in character. However, we're seeing that that law is being quite widely ignored, and most school assemblies now, I would say probably the majority, don't lead children in prayer. So this is more unusual. And again, the older generation, they would likely have had the habit of going to church at Christmas and Easter, maybe Harvest Festival. Their parents may have prayed with them before they went to bed. They may have prayed before meals. And religious broadcasting on television and the radio would have brought the Christian seasons and their music, Christmas carols and Easter hymns, into their homes. But British culture has now lost these Christian moorings. The dominant cultural phenomena operate on what the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor has called the immanent frame, a disenchanted world created by individualism, in which the search for truth and meaning is replaced by a consumerist quest for status, stimulation, and material comfort. So I'm arguing that secularization in the UK operates on these two levels. One, on an intellectual rejection of God among elites, and the other, a more popular cultural disconnection from the patterns of Christian life. This is the main narrative around religion in the UK, and indeed in most Western countries, certainly European countries. People are losing their faith. They're becoming less Christian and more non-religious. But there are two qualifications I want to make about this trend in relation to the significance of Christianity in the United Kingdom today. The first is that it's very easy to allow this data to fuel a narrative about church decline that gives a distorted picture of religious life in the past. So, for example, Britain is full of large churches built by the Victorians, like this one in Brighton, where my friend happens to be the vicar. And many of these churches, this one isn't closed, but it's certainly not as full as it would allow to be on a Sunday. And many have closed or derelict or repurposed. And in the national psyche, they kind of symbolize the decline of Christianity. But sociologist Robin Gill has shown how many of these churches, in fact, had never been full, even in the Victorian era. And they were part of the over-provision by Victorian philanthropists who had this kind of high-minded Christian ideal that everyone should have a seat in their parish church, even though people never went to church in those numbers. Church attendance has certainly declined since the Second World War, but much of the shift in the census data is not from practicing Christians to atheist, but rather from nominal or cultural Christian to just uncommitted. And as I sometimes put it, apathy used to be called Church of England. Now apathy is called no religion. It's a shift in label, not necessarily in practice. And in fact, Christian life in the UK remains very strong. There are 40,300 church buildings used for worship, attended regularly by 3 million people. Many are new or repurposed churches founded by immigrant communities of different denominations and language groups. So this is one of the many black churches that's now opened in London, sometimes really enormous congregations from Nigeria, Ghana, other African countries. There's another medieval church in the City of London, which is now used by a very large Mandarin-speaking Chinese congregation. So it might be that we actually have a sort of resource allocation problem. in that many British churches will be these historic medieval buildings reflecting the infrastructure of a pre-industrial rural economy, and they're now attended by just a handful of sort of elderly people. But across urban centres, warehouses and theatres are being converted into places of worship for thousands of people. And these congregations, as you can see from the enthusiasm of these worshippers, tend to be more overt in living out their Christian life through volunteering, through witness, through financial giving, than the historic Church of England, which has always had a sort of reputation for being a bit more staid, a bit more quiet, and a sort of antidote to religious enthusiasm. So there is a renewal of Christian life through immigration. But it's also true that in spite of the decline of cultural Christianity, the legacy of Christian hegemony, let's call it Christendom, is still remarkably strong. The Church of England is the largest single provider of schools, for example, educating more than 1 million children in the UK. Then there's the role of the church in welfare provision. We are currently experiencing a very serious cost of living crisis in the UK, partly because of Brexit, leaving the European Union, partly for other reasons, fuel prices because of the war in Ukraine. So prices have gone up, fuel bills more than doubled, and people are really struggling. And recent research has shown that faced with rising deprivation, just under 3 million citizens have accessed support from the churches, whether through food banks like this one, which is a church in South London. And again, it's a church that has a relatively small congregation. So they've divided the church up into the area where they continue to worship. But then most of the church is given over to running this food bank for the community. Many churches also run night shelters for homeless people, or some this winter have just been open as public spaces that are kept warm for people who can't afford to heat their homes. And of course, England retains many of the formal structures of one of the most established churches in the world. So Christian prayers are said every day in Parliament. And perhaps most notably, we are the only historically Christian country to have retained clergy in the legislature. 26 bishops sit by right in the House of Lords, which is our second legislative chamber. And this, of course, reflects the fact that our head of state, King Charles, is the supreme governor of the church, which we'll refer back to. This is 2 bishops exercising their function in the House of Lords, and the one standing is the Archbishop of Canterbury, who is bears the title. He is the first peer of the realm. Now, these things are now relatively historic and symbolic. What that means is that in the hierarchy of the nation, he ranks just below royalty. He's more senior than the Prime Minister. He's the first peer of the realm, and that's reflected in the role he has in conferring sovereignty onto the monarch, as we'll come to see. Now, it's easy to say, and it's very, very commonly said, that all these legacies of Christian culture are now an anachronism. They're out of date. It's argued that we should have just secular schools, we should have an elected second parliamentary chamber, perhaps we should even have a president and not a king. That's sort of outdated. And that may be true, but rather than just saying they shouldn't be there, I think it's worth interrogating why these legacies of Christendom do persist in a society that's secularizing, and why there actually appears to be little will to get rid of them. Parents want their children to go to church schools, believing that it sort of instills good values and perhaps discipline. Many people, particularly on the political left, complain about the bishops being in the Lords, but then they find themselves supporting the campaigns that the bishops lead on, such as better treatment of refugees and opposing some of the more progressive actions of the government. It's finding a kind of compliant church in its role in politics. Now, we sometimes talk about being in a post-secular age, and different theorists from Habermas to Taylor define this in their own way. But I sometimes think that what this term points to is not necessarily the resurgence of religion, at least not numerically, so much as a sort of failure of secular concepts and movements to provide attractive alternatives to what religion has provided. And so we might say that religion is punching above its weight, at least numerically, or that religion is kind of haunting societies like the UK, whose secular projects, be they liberal democratic or neoliberal capitalist or socialist, have somehow failed to run as deep as these historic religious identities. So that's the first trend that I wanted to explore with you, a shift away from cultural Christianity, but in a culture where the legacy of Christendom is still very strong. The second trend that we saw on those charts at the start of the lecture, and indeed another sense in which we might describe Britain as post-secular, is the growth in religious minorities. Remember, from 6% to 11% in 20 years. Now, obviously, this is a very diverse group representing a range of immigrant communities with different status and experience in British societies. There has been a Jewish community in England, at least since their readmittance under Oliver Cromwell in 1656. Benjamin Disraeli was a Jewish convert to Christianity who served as Prime Minister twice under Queen Victoria over a century ago. So while the Jewish community is small, under 300,000 people, it's a community that's now well established with a level of affluence and influence. And here, talking to the Chief Rabbi of England and Wales at an event that I'll come back to later. But it's also true that the demographics of this community is shifting, as they are in Israel, towards away from less liberal believers towards the ultra-Orthodox, who tend to have much larger families, maybe restricted participation in community education, and often a less financially secure, more dependent on the state. So there's a kind of shift taking place in that community. The Muslim community is certainly still, might be said to be in the process of still establishing itself. It's grown dramatically more recently through immigration, principally from Asia. And this is also a community with large families. Of a population of nearly 4 million, over half are under 19. So it's a really young population. And the need to provide for this community, to build mosques, to provide Muslim schools, to introduce Muslim chaplaincy in public institutions, this is a major issue and a cause of some intercultural tensions. The structures of representation for this community are less developed than they are in the Jewish community. And some governments, particularly conservative governments, have had some suspicion about the ideologies that are shaping the main representative bodies. Nonetheless, the Muslim community is growing in status as well as in number, with most famously London having the first Muslim mayor of any European capital city. And here he is, Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London. And this is a photograph from his swearing-in ceremony when he became mayor, which I think very strategically he asked for it to take place in one of the cathedrals in London. So this is taking place in Southwark Cathedral. So as the first Muslim mayor of any European capital city, he is being kind of invited by the church into their place of worship for this civic ceremony. It's a very interesting kind of secular, post-secular kind of arrangement. And so, we hear about rising Islamophobia in Europe, but the Pew Research Centre found in 2019, quite recently, that only 18% of British people have an unfavourable view of Muslims, while 78% of Britons have a favourable view. And that's the most favourable rating across the whole of Europe. Hindus are the third largest grouping after Christians and Muslims, and their rising prominence is demonstrated in the figure on the right, who some of you may recognize. He's now our Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, the first Hindu Prime Minister of Great Britain. The Sikh community is now significant as well, located principally in London and the West Midlands. One of the themes of research that's of interest to our unit has been how the politics and interreligious dynamics of countries of origin are impacting on British community relations. In recent years, that's particularly focused on the politics of India, where the rise of Hindu nationalism and the consequent tensions with minority communities is manifesting itself within British communities. And it seems within the Sikh community, there is an increase in more overt religiosity, interpreted inevitably by some as a rise in extremism. And there's certainly some cause for concern. Since 2016, we've seen some coverage of protests within the Sikh community against intermarriage, marriage of non-Sikhs. And there's also a lot more activism in support of the movement for an autonomous Sikh state, Khalistan. But as an academic colleague, Jagbir Jyoti Johal, has pointed out, we need to be wary of, by default, labeling any political opinion that arises out of religious belief as extremist. That's a very European way of thinking. And the same might be said for supporters of India's ruling BJP party. In the West, we've come to think that religious and political beliefs should be unrelated. Now, the reality, of course, is very different. But it seems to me an important aspect of religious freedom that it should be allowed to connect to legitimate political positions. Nonetheless, there are concerns all round that these political affiliations, as they're manifesting in the UK, are damaging interfaith relations, especially with the Muslim community, and even leading to violence. So just last year, we saw some riots in an English city called Leicester that was sparked by sporting events between India and Pakistan. And the city saw several days of protests, knife crime and vandalism, particularly directed at mosques and temples. But I don't want to exaggerate these tensions, and I think they're usually mitigated by very strong inter-community relationships at the leadership level. And I think this is a very distinctive aspect of the British religious scene, strong interfaith networks at a leadership level, for reasons we'll come on to explore and perhaps even further in questions. But with these growing immigrant populations, Britain is connected to the interreligious dynamics of the world and its tensions. Today, you can't separate the local from the global, and I'm sure that's true here in Indonesia as well. So, to return to our high-level overview of Britain and of religion in Britain today, we've got this paradoxical picture, I think. On the one hand, the biggest and most noticeable trend in the data is a move towards religious non-affiliation, but that masks an enduring Christian legacy, a very vital and to some extent renewed Christian presence, and significant growth across all minority faith traditions. This is why I think that the term post-secular helpfully describes our situation. Britain is complexly religious and it's complexly secularized. So let's move on to ask how we as a country, as British people, hold this plurality together. Now, another reason why I like the term post-secular is that Britain has never adopted the more extreme strands of European secularism that the professor alluded to at the start, that we might perhaps describe as programmatic secularism, something very ideologically seeking to eradicate religion from public institutions and the public sphere. Now, we associate that approach, of course, perhaps with France, where religion is theoretically excluded from public institutions. And of course, again, the United States, whose constitution stipulates at least a notional separation of church and state. As indicated earlier, Christianity remains very embedded in the structures of the British state. And that's going to be seen very starkly on the 6th of May this year, when King Charles and Queen Camilla will be crowned in Westminster Abbey. There are other historically Christian countries that have retained or reinstated their monarchies, Norway, the Netherlands, and Spain, for example. But Britain is the only one to retain the coronation rituals of medieval Christendom. In particular, as well as the crown being placed on King Charles' head, that's what coronation means, the ceremony will also include the anointing with oil, which doesn't happen in other coronation ceremonies in Christian nations. And this is an allusion to the anointing of the kings in the Bible. That will be carried out by the Archbishop of Canterbury as a symbol of conferring sacred power of the church onto the new monarch in the manner of the prophet Samuel, anointing King David, and then, as will be sung in the music by Handel while the anointing takes place, the anointing of King Solomon by Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet. This is a postcard of the 1953 coronation, the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. And it's the moment just before she is anointed. Now you can see behind her four men holding a canopy, and that was brought over to cover her in front of the congregation while she was anointed, because she's anointed on her head and on her hands, but also on her breast. And so her clothes were partially opened, and the canopy was there for discretion. And in fact, you may know the 1953 coronation was obviously the first that was televised. And at that moment, the cameras just went black because it was felt that this was too sacred a moment for people to watch in their living rooms at home. This wasn't, this was inappropriate. I'm sure this year the televisions won't go black. We will see something, but I think there will be a canopy just because of the discretion required at this kind of sacred and quite sort of intimate moment. So you can see from the description of this ritual, the clergy and all the ceremony and everything, this is a deeply symbolic ritual from the pre-modern era that's used to inaugurate a modern head of state. Now, that's clearly incompatible with a programmatic secularism, but it may also seem difficult to square with what we might call a procedural secularism, a way of going about things in a modern multicultural nation that needs to enable a range of religious expressions of religious identity. So not a programmatic secularism that's seeking to kind of push religion out entirely, but a procedural secularism that's trying to navigate the complexities of diversity and allow for the flourishing of everybody. Now, perhaps for the reasons of this tension, the king himself has been very explicit about his own vision of a religiously plural Britain. During the period of national mourning that followed the death of his mother, Queen Elizabeth, King Charles hosted a reception for faith leaders at Buckingham Palace. It was seen as very, very important. Obviously, he made visits to the four nations during that period, but time was very tight, and then all the foreign dignitaries arrived for the funeral of the late Queen. But time was set aside 2 days before the funeral to invite all senior faith leaders of all religions to Buckingham Palace. And he gave a speech. I'm just going to read a little extract. I have always thought of Britain as a community of communities. That has led me to understand that the sovereign has an additional duty, less formally recognized, but to be no less diligently discharged. It is the duty to protect the diversity of our country, including by protecting the space for faith itself and its practice through the religions, cultures, traditions, and beliefs to which our hearts and minds direct us as individuals. This diversity is not just enshrined in the laws of our country. It is enjoined by my own faith. As a member of the Church of England, my Christian beliefs have love at their very heart. By my most profound convictions, therefore, as well as by my position as sovereign, I hold myself bound to respect those who follow other spiritual paths, as well as those who seek to live their lives in accordance with secular ideals. Now, as with everything a head of state says, this is, of course, a very carefully crafted statement, expressing the view that the protection of religious freedom is not some kind of accommodation. It's not a watering down of faith commitment. For King Charles, at least, it comes out of a depth of his convictions. Now, this is very important in a world of rising ideologies of religious exclusivity. Hospitality to other religions, or even partnerships with them, is viewed as a dilution of our own faith, and believers who do this are seen as traitors within their religious tradition. But it seems to me the future of religious pluralism rests on our ability to say that the opposite is the case. We need to understand how that openness to the religious other is itself a sacred religious obligation in the way that the king articulated in that speech. There was a phrase at the start that you may have picked up on as well, of the nation as a community of communities. Now, that was very deliberate. It offers a particular view of the nation state, and it has its own lineage in what's called the English pluralist school. It's a term that seems to have been coined in its Latin form, communitatis communitatum, by an Anglican, a Church of England monk, priest, and political thinker called John Neville Figgis, in his book, Churches in the Modern State, which was published in 1913. Now, Figgis lived from 1866 to 1919. And so he witnessed a period of great political turbulence across Europe that culminated in the First World War. He saw the rise of powerful totalitarian nations across Europe. And he believed that the continental model of statehood itself was to some degree at fault. And he thought that an attractive feature of English political thought was that it rested not on a false belief, a false conception of the state as the only political entity apart from the individual, which he saw as a dominant understanding of citizenship in France and in Germany. It's just you, the individual citizen, and the state, nothing in between. This kind of social contract, exclusively mediating the relationship between the state and the individual citizen, was, he believed, at variance with the freedom of all other communal life and ultimately that of the individual. Figgis saw an extremely important role, therefore, for what he and others sometimes call intermediate institutions, multiple micro-societies that make up the larger society of the nation. And these, of course, include religious institutions, like the church, like other religious communities. But they extend to any institution that forms a collective belonging between members, such as a university. Defending this plural understanding of society was, he believed, essential to the pursuit of freedom. Our first aim, he writes, must be to endeavor to induce men by persuasion and all means morally legitimate to admit the positive right of societies to exist, not just a society, but plural societies. It's also worth noting that he was a monk, which was a form of religious expression that had been abolished in England by Henry VIII at the Reformation and only reintroduced in the Victorian era, late in the 19th century, as part of what's known as the Catholic revival of the Church of England. And at this time, therefore, monasteries were subject to much cultural suspicion. There was a lot of negativity about Roman Catholics in English culture at this time, and that was projected onto communities like his that kind of looked a bit Roman Catholic. They were rather suspicious of them. And they were even liable to prosecution for some of the laws that continued to outlaw, to forbid Roman Catholic practices like putting candles on altars or wearing vestments at the Mass. And that's part of where he's coming from, wanting these religious traditions that other people view with suspicion to be respected and allowed to exist alongside one another. Now, it's important to say that the intermediate institutions, including faith groups that he's talking about, are not, of course, outside of the law. Indeed, Figgis acknowledges a right for government control to ensure that they function in accordance with the good of wider society. You can't just let people do what they want. It's more the case that these institutions mediate the statutory legal entitlements of their members through codes and conventions of their own. Figgis writes, except in a small and highly underdeveloped society, very many transactions must take place which depend for their validity on the character of men and not on any legal instrument. In other words, there are principles of transparency, accountability, and freedom that do need to be enshrined in law, much of which we now articulate in terms of human rights, to free speech, to private life, to freedom of personal expression, and so forth. But for intermediate institutions to flourish, these human rights need to be received and exercised within the context of a shaped ethos, shared beliefs and values and aspirations, which extend beyond the law. And all of those are important attributes of faith communities, both monastic communities, like the one that Figgis followed, where, yes, they're under the law, but they also follow their own rules of living a life together. And you can see parallels with different religious communities in the UK today. So King Charles' use of this term, community of communities, is sort of the extension of a tradition of religious toleration and plurality internal to English Christianity into a contemporary context of multiple faith traditions. It's a kind of evolution of a model of intra-religious tolerance to inter-religious challenges. So the model of religious plurality, English form of procedural secularism, if you like, is one of an established church, not enforcing a monopoly, but making room in a largely secularized society for diverse religious expression. There are certainly questions about the sustainability of this model. Will it make sense or even be possible for the Church of England to take this role when it's smaller than other Christian or even non-Christian faith groups? Does this Christian oversight amount to a systematically racialized privilege that we ought to challenge at a deeper level? As it has changed in the past, this model will undoubtedly evolve in the future. But it does seem to me that Britain's is an example of a procedural secularism that from the outside might look a bit strange, might look a bit anomalous or archaic, but which has been remarkably robust at fostering religious pluralism. And particularly, as I say, through the strong relationships between faith leaders, which has come very much from the top down, particularly in relation to the role of the monarch. Rather than programmatically marginalizing religion, it operates through the notion of a host religious institution that is proactive in fostering religious freedom for all. And I've ended with this slide of the inside of Westminster Abbey. That is, the coronation will take place in May, because it gives us this image of this very spacious and capacious religious institution, which perhaps symbolizes the way in which the Church of England as an established church has sought to make space, make room for plurality. And I think this model is very significant because the growing trend we see around the world is a disintegration of some of the more programmatic secular approaches in Turkey, for example, in India, and even in several European countries. And my conviction is that we'll need to develop models of global religious plurality that extend, that really pay attention to the particular histories of the countries where they're located, and that evolve more organically in response to changing religious dynamics through immigration, through forms of secularization, through all the things that we've been looking for, and respond to them for the sake of a common future and for mutual human flourishing. So I hope that's given you a good overview of religious trends in the UK, and I'd be really keen to hear your reflections and perhaps learn a bit more about the situation here in Indonesia. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. One thing that I have in mind that I probably could later explain also about the relationship between the king and also the state. I mean, the prime minister, and the power that they both have, how much they relate to one another. They could influence. I was expecting that they could influence the communities of the members. That is advocated by the Chawas. But I will bring this first to the floor. If you have any questions, comments on that talk, please raise your hands. We could have 3. So we start from Mas Leo, Mas Tio, and then Mas Reza. So Mas Leo is our editor. I saw the file. Yeah. No. Okay, so let's start with Mas Leo. Mas Leo is our doctoral professor at SCMS. So please. Okay,
wait for the mic.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor, for your the size much illuminating the presentation. I have 2 questions. One is about the document itself. Presumably, today, the raising of non-affiliated membership of any country in the UK is taking from the younger generation. I just wonder how the document would respond to that, how they try to reformate the information, reform itself to this kind of direction. Secondly, I don't know whether you hear of that our previous Jakarta was a Pakistani born English.
Yes. Yes, that's right.
And he supported our program on literacy, who worked our religious extension officer to Agama Indonesia. And he wanted to learn, and I want to get insight from our program here in Indonesia to somehow a case for learning in the UK. But the challenging is because the state cannot intervene in any religious affair, or that's my impression of our discussion with the So I just wonder, is it true that kind of arrangement?
The state can't interfere in the affairs of religious communities.
Okay, and also the interfaith kind of issues that somehow Indonesia is we are mingling with government intervention and grassroots initiative for arrangement of engagement.
Sorry, I don't quite understand the second question. So the British ambassador was saying that there's a limit to what?
Okay.
Yes.
The state cannot truly intervene any dialogue, interfaith dialogue, and so on. Maybe I don't know the real means.
Okay.
Here we saw everywhere how the state intervened.
I see. Okay. Okay. Interesting.
Here the state government.
Okay. Okay. I got it. Of course, I have to remember.
So,
would it be all right if I respond? But I've got a small brain. I won't remember all that better. So yes, on the demographics of the Church of England, I mean, this is absolutely critical because what we're seeing is a huge drop-off among younger people in the established church. And so that's partly behind the point that I raised at the end. Is this a sustainable model of thinking about national religion, about structures of pluralism and so forth. The Church of England has declined for the best part of 6 decades. I don't think we've stopped declining. Now, there are forms of expression within the Church of England that's appealing more to young people. There are other non-Anglican forms of Christianity that also seem to be connecting better with young people. But in terms of the structures of the existing church, I think they are sustainable demographically, and we're going to see some big shifts in the future. And I'm not quite sure what that looks like, and I'm glad I'm not the person responsible for it, but that's the critical thing. In terms of engagement in religious affairs, I mean, of course, I wouldn't want to contradict His Excellency, and I'm sure I see the point he's making. I think the state intervenes in religious affairs in the UK when it wants to. I mean, it has intervened in the regulation of Islam through concerns about counter-extremism in a way that is often deeply resented by the Muslim community. So I wouldn't want to say that the British government doesn't interfere in religion, when what I mean is, well, they haven't really interfered much in my own. I think there has been that issue with Islamic ideologies, and I suspect with what's going on with the Sikh and the Hindu communities, we might start to see a little bit more government involvement in those religions too. Government's very limited in its ability to regulate religious communities for a number of reasons. One of them is lack of religious literacy. People don't understand these communities, and that's led to a kind of ineffectiveness, I think, in counter-extremism, counter-terrorism strategies, and a kind of ignorance about where problems were emerging. So, for example, early on, after 9/11 and other terrorist incidents, there was a real scrutiny of what was going on in mosques. But it quickly became apparent that actually mosques weren't the problem. In many ways, mosques were the solution, that people were being radicalized outside of mosques, where they weren't engaging with kind of the wisdom of the elders and, everything that you get with that sort of community. So, and the thinking has evolved and is not entirely ineffective, but there are forms of intervention. I would say generally the culture has been to leave religion be until it's causing a problem.
Sorry, I think that's the meaning of the physics lesson. That's my own phrase. Yes. But I think you are correct. That's the physics lesson saying that we got to establish that orientation to deal with the.
Yeah, and culturally, I guess it's for this very reason that the church has stood alongside the state, the monarch, as a powerful institution, and a relationship of respect has been built, not one of subordination. But now the culture is changing; things evolve. There's 2 other questions, Lindsay.
You want to directly respond to the issue subject?
I was just going to say, I'm thinking about the intervention of the state within schools, faith schools. There is a question there about how much they do interfere in what is being taught or what is not being taught. So in that regard, I think there is some active state intervention to suppose preclude any problematics in what these schools decide not to teach.
And so it raises a question of like what is acceptable religion and what's unacceptable religion, what is the state prepared to legitimize and not legitimize. And I think the instinct of the British state is to legitimize anything that kind of looks like the Church of England, in the sense of kind of it's fairly depoliticized, it's doing good in the community. But then when things are associated with perhaps more political positions, like the ones I alluded to earlier in different communities, or where their values are really kind of pushing up very hard against some of the more progressive liberal values that are dominating in society, then there's anxiety. Does something need to be done? And I think, yeah, we're seeing more of a rub than we used to. Thank you.
And you're talking
Thanks,
about
Lindsay.
what the schools, like the private schools.
No, they are actually government funded. Government.
Let's take these other questions. There are lots of hands.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Professor Morris. I just want to know, as you said in your presentation, that Islam is the second largest growing religion in the UK. I want to know, are in UK, which one? I want to ask about conflict. Which one between the Christian and the happen between Christian and the growing number of Muslim, or the Christian within another minority religion? And about the government interview, I want to know about if the numbers of the Muslims is growing, it means they need the place of worship.
Yeah.
And as you know, in Indonesia, all kind of mosques, they use the loudspeaker.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And what about the regulation in the government allowing the mosque use the loudspeaker, because sometimes in Indonesia it becomes
a flashpoint. Right. Yeah. Oh yes, no, I heard earlier. Yes, absolutely, no, for sure. Yeah.
Are the government of the state regulate how they live? Maybe they will clustering the Christian or clustering the Muslim, or just they are mingled as a one community. Yes,
okay.
Maybe that's what
Great. Thanks. Yeah. No, pleasure. Thank you. Thanks for the question. So yes, there's no doubt that the quite dramatic growth in the Muslim community over recent years, as has happened in most European countries, is causing some cultural tensions. And part of the reason for that is, as I say earlier, this question of like, what's legitimate religion, what's not legitimate religion. We're conscious that coming from non-Christian culture, Islam looks as if it has a sort of a stronger political vision than we think is the case within our own religious traditions. People feel threatened by that. And yes, there's a need for facilities, and particularly the building of mosques, which does cause tensions within some communities. I don't know the law about the regulation of muezzin and all that kind of thing. And perhaps my colleagues know more than I do, but I certainly know that these questions are being asked, and it's sort of part of Christian culture and British culture, especially, that you hear church bells ringing, and a lot of people say, "Oh, that's just that's a nice thing," but it is a call to worship. It's exactly the same thing. And so the question is being raised: well, what is the difference, and why shouldn't mosques, allow this to happen? So there are some tensions, but as I showed from the Pew data, it does seem that there are fewer tensions between the majority Christian populations and Muslim minority in the UK than in other European countries. I think there's a number of reasons for that. One is one is the good work that has been done at a kind of a leadership level between faith leaders. There are very few communities where Christian and Muslim leaders aren't working very closely hand in hand. And of course, we saw a lot of this around the pandemic, and when mosques and churches need to be regulated, and often that was done jointly between Muslim and Christian leaders. So there are tensions, but I don't want to overstate them in the British context, I think. And then in terms of where these communities are living, that can be a bit more problematic, but certainly not regulated by the government. Muslim communities are tending to live in more disadvantaged areas because they're poorer, so that's where the housing is affordable and so on. And also people are wanting to move where there are mosques, and Muslim schools that they can send their children to and everything. And I think that's the pattern that we've seen of immigration historically. When the Jewish community moved into East London, and that was where the synagogues were, that was where you could get kosher food. It's now kind of migrated more to North London, but that seems to be the pattern. But government doesn't have any regulation of that in the UK. Good question.
Thank you. Yes, we still have a lot of time.
Yes, good.
Yeah. Thank you. My name is Rizan. Yeah. I'm sorry. I need to sit because I have to read my question. So I'm interested with what you said about the procedural for secularism, and also with the top-down model of religious pluralism, management model, if I can say. When you say that you have the strong interfaith network between leaders, between religious leaders. So how does it apply with the intra-religious variation? Because at least inside the body of the established Christian church, English Christian church, for instance, the different standards to various social and political issues. Because I think it is interesting because to relate with your earlier statement about the limited capacity of governance to religious communities, because even when there is a plurality of religions, different religions, but I wonder if there is a single definition of the accepted Christianity, the accepted Islam, the accepted religion of any other religion that we have said. So I think it is interesting to see the plurality not only from the interreligious aspect, but also the
absolutely. And I think the church, this model I presented to you is quite interesting in that it is being held together by the historic form of Christianity in England, the established church. And part of the reason why that it has worked up until now is yes, it's top down, but it's top to bottom in that England has a presence in every community. It has a parish network, which means that every citizen lives within a jurisdiction of a priest, and that priest is under the authority of the bishop. The bishops work collectively, they work with government, so it's all joined up, you know. And so, for example, the government a little while ago wanted to put some resource into improving relations between faith communities on the ground, and it called this fund the Near Neighbours Fund. And you needed two faith groups, so it could be Jewish and Christian or Hindu and Muslim or whatever, but they used the network of the Church of England to kind of administrate this. So the parish priest would always be involved, even if kind of their church wasn't involved. So it's got these useful structures. However, the established church is the one that is kind of probably most rapidly declining. And new forms of Christianity are emerging that have very different ways of viewing things, are less hierarchical, less structured. And there may also be they might be immigrant communities from parts of the world where there's big tensions with other religions. So I'm very involved in interfaith things in the UK and in London. And it can be difficult sometimes to get some of the Pentecostal Christian churches involved in interfaith work, because often they are from African countries where there's a lot of tensions with Muslims. And so overcoming that, you know, is a big cultural obstacle, and getting them to see things kind of differently in the UK context. So there is absolutely a plurality within Christianity. Of course, there's a plurality within all of these communities as well. And in some ways, you know, that's sort of presented this very harmonious pyramid model of religious cohesion, but it's being disrupted and being challenged by diversity within each tradition, within Christianity especially. Thank you.
Is there already some kind of policy or actions from the established church to treat that?
I mean, the church can't regulate other faith communities, you know, even less than the government's able to, but I think it's trying to model something. And so the main ecumenical Christian organizations within the UK, I would say, have a certain flavor to them that encourages engagement with other faiths that you don't see in other European countries even. So I think, you know, these spaces can be quite challenging. I was at I'm chaplain at the LSE as well as doing all the other things that I do. And I went to a chaplaincy conference recently, and there were Christian chaplains from other countries where there were a lot of tensions with Muslims, and they were very challenged by a lot of our approach and what we were saying and so forth. And so that's happening within the UK as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you for your presentation. My name is Simon Amwana. I'm from UGM. You have talked about British religious plurality in the age of Charles III. Recently, religious globalization has been characterized by a widespread of Pentecostal denominations. Then I want to know what's the position of Pentecostal denominations in this British religious plurality. I mean, for example, in the city of London, you have so many Pentecostal denominations, like the way we know it in Latin America, in Africa, even in many countries in Asia. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
What's your name again? Sorry. What's your name again?
My name is Simon. I'm Simon.
Simon. Okay. From Georgia, originally? From Georgia, originally? Originally from?
Yeah. I'm
Georgia.
From Africa. Yes, Africa.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. No, well, Pentecostal Christianity has a significant and growing place within the British religious scene. And with the census data that I presented at the start, that was just kind of dumped on us last year. But now they're starting to kind of drill down into that and find out where growth in religious communities has been, how that links to ethnicity. And so one of the trends that we're seeing is a huge growth in Black churches in London, and those predominantly being Pentecostal. I think, you know, this is one of the disruptions to the established church, because we haven't had Pentecostal Christianity for that long, and it has different ways of doing things and thinking about things. And following on from the last question, perhaps sometimes they're coming from countries where there are interreligious tensions, you know, that we're thinking about and navigating. But I've been very impressed by the Pentecostal leadership insofar as it's organized within the UK, and the Churches Together in England and Wales is now chaired by a Pentecostal bishop, which is a huge step forward and, you know, very significant in the status of the Pentecostal community in the UK. One of the interesting things about Pentecostalism, of course, is it's the opposite of the Church of England in that it's very diffuse and democratic, and pastors can set up their own initiatives, and there are some bodies that you can affiliate to, but not necessarily. And so there's a great diversity, and some challenges have arisen within some of these churches that the nation's having to think about, along with, you know, the rest of this new religious diversity. But you know, it's very and even within the LSE campus, it's one of our significant Christian communities there.
Okay,
At the back.
You come here. You come here. So we can see your body. Thank you very much. I am Abdi. I am the citizen of Kingdom of Jakarta, Indonesia. So yeah, thank you very much for bringing up the issue of Charles III. I remember that Charles III in 94, 2 years before his divorce with Diana, said that he is the defender, rather than defender of the faith. He said that he is the defender of faith.
Yes.
So, and he tried to revise or something like that. In 2015, they're saying that the defender of faith is will be protecting the faith rather than, in order to not cross the Anglican Church. But for me, as a citizen of the Jakarta Kingdom, it's always tempted to compare the Charles III with my king. His Excellency Ngaso dalam Sultan dari HB the 10th So 7 years ago, my king, who is also a religious leader in his title, he relinquished his title as a religious leader in order to, as a response to this kind of diversity or the diverse situation in Jakarta. And the title actually was the Khalifatullah Sayyidin Tanah. It means the God's representation in the world and also the leader of Islam, something like that. And Sultan relinquished it in 2015 in front of many people, in front of his people. My question is, will it happen actually in UK? Could Charles III or the kingdom or the king or the queen of England or the British do the same thing, relinquish his title as the defender of faith? Because the defender of faith he got from the Pope, the second Leo M.
Yes, well done.
And then start from there, the king of the England become the defender of faith. So maybe not in Charles III, maybe in the William or Harry, I don't know, but could allow constitutionally a king would relinquish the title if it really happens, if it does still happen. How far the kingdom will change?
Okay, good question. So I think what I've described is a title that's been redefined. And as you pointed out in that famous BBC interview that then Prince Charles did a while ago, he talked about being defender of faith instead of defender of the faith. That was something that people kind of went vaguely hysterical about, it seems to me. And actually the intention behind what he was saying was exactly what his mother was modeling already. King Charles hasn't invented all of this. This is kind of, what he's picked up. So that title that was given to the British monarchs before the Reformation, before the Church of England broke away from the Roman Catholic Church, has been repeatedly redefined. It was redefined after the Reformation as relating to the supreme governor of the Church of England instead of the Pope, and now it's been redefined again as relating to some kind of protector of religious diversity. So I love your comparison with your monarch here, because part of what I'm talking about with global religious pluralities is a kind of organic way of proceeding secularly and working out what that looks like in different historic contexts. And our tradition may continue to evolve, and we may in the future go into a situation where that title no longer serves its purpose either. I think what I hope I've also shown is that if we take that religious dimension out of British monarchy, then it becomes something completely different. And I think probably it becomes something unsustainable. I think we'll become a republic. I think the sacred is so embedded in what monarchy means in the UK that it can't be secularized. And I guess one could point to the sort of constitutional monarchies of the Netherlands or Spain or whatever. But I don't know, British monarchy is its own particular tradition, which I think has some kind of sacred function that it serves. So yes, it might go, but I think we'd become a republic, which some people will be very happy about. I'd be a little sad.
Thank you. Hey. Thank you very much for your presentation. I think it is very interesting to know more about the religious situation in England.
from your presentation, you said that Christianity in England, British is now maybe have a different situation, but the Christian legacy is still strong there, which is I also completely agree with you. But sometimes I always, I'm a big fan of Manchester United.
That's its own religion.
Yeah. But when I look into your foreign policy through your geopolitics policy, I think there is no just like Christian value in there.
Right.
Which means they always, they with your Romans, United States of America, they go to war to Middle East, they go to war to now Ukraine.
Yeah.
So it reminds a question in my mind: what kind of Christianity that evolved in British now? Is it Old Testament Christianity or New Testament Christianity? And what do you think about this new King Charles III? As far as we know that he has a big supportive thing to interfaith relation. Which do you think will this have a influence to the British foreign policy, or is still the same? Thank you.
Those are big questions, and I mean, it raises the question of what might it mean to talk about Christian foreign policy? And I don't know what we would look at. I mean, Christian foreign policies presumably included the Crusades, and I don't think it's gone wrong recently. I'm not sure we've ever really known what Christian foreign policy would be. And in some ways, I think some of the misguided interventions over the last century or so, or even the colonial era, was grounded in Christian ideals of universalism and a sense that what we had in the West was special and should be shared with the rest of the world. And I don't think that is Christianity, by the way, but I think that's kind of what Christianity was evolved into or interpreted as by our political leaders. So I part of what's happened in the secularization, the complex secularization of Christianity in the West, is I think it did morph into a Western worldview of liberal values and democracy and human rights and free markets and so forth, which we thought we had the right to impose on the rest of the world, or that the rest of the world would kind of willingly embrace. And I think that's where a lot of things have gone wrong. I mean, interestingly, more recently, I think the war in Ukraine has raised more questions in government about religion and foreign policy, and why and how we relate to two Christian countries that are at war with one another, and what role we have as a Christian country in relation to that. And the church has been working quite closely with government about that. I know that. And how does this differ, both in policy terms, but also just in terms of feeling and psychology, to wars with non-Christian countries, wars with Muslim countries, which we've mostly fought, over the last few years. So I think those questions are very live, very complex. How will King Charles influence all of this stuff? Who knows? He has a weekly meeting with the Prime Minister that is entirely confidential. We'll never find out. Of course, it was always said that his mother was very apolitical, never commented on political things. And King Charles has always had a reputation of being more opinionated, but often about things that I think have appealed to a deeper moral sensibility. I mean, environment. King Charles has been very concerned about climate change for a very long time. And I think the kinds of causes he's going to push with government will be in those kinds of areas. I've never heard him express any particular view on foreign policy, so I can't imagine he's going to get very involved in that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We still have 10 minutes.
Good.
To use.
Good. A woman.
Hello, good afternoon.
Hi. I'm well. How are you?
Okay, so I would like to. My name is Icha. I'm from CRCS, and I would like to ask about maybe following this idea of religious plurality. It always comes to issues of maybe like gender issues and other like global issues that has been the concern of maybe young generations. I mean, with the idea of the social media, anything that happens outside of our country, and then the younger generation might realize that, oh, this could come to us as well. And I would like to ask about like what will be commitment like comments by the King Charles III era regarding to this issue, or maybe what kind of approach that will be done to the young generations as the UK have these rising numbers of these religions or like non-affiliated religions coming up, and yeah, how the government or maybe the state of the UK try to overcome this, as if the young generations, you know, we have this a lot of demands, we have freedom of speech, freedom of expressions, and maybe some of us think that religions gonna have this kind of borders in the way of we're expressing ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, again, I think it's an area where government is not going to intervene. It doesn't really understand the area. It's not too concerned about it. And I should say we have a government that doesn't perceive a more secular younger generation as any kind of problem. Whether or not it is, that's not a government concern. I think it's very easy to generalize and stereotype about generations. And I think I see, and I work with young people at LSE from 150 countries, and there's a kind of huge spectrum. And so I'm very nervous about saying like young people think this or do this. And, among our young people and many of them British young people, there is people are finding new kinds of religion and are taking their religious commitments more seriously. And I think, again, there can be a bit of a stereotype, that when we think about religious institutions, we rush to think of the way in which they oppress women or minorities and so forth. But it's always a more complex picture than that, and quite often faith is a vehicle for expressing these things and for inclusion and so forth. So I see that trend, and I also see a kind of a disconnection from religious institutions and a disconnection from the sort of, I think, like disciplines and sense of obligations that older generations had within a religious worldview, a desire to maximize freedom and opportunity that is perhaps less religious, to kind of less inclined to commit to a particular religious path. I think that's one of the trends we see as well, and we certainly see that in the UK, and how those two sides of the coin are going to play out is quite interesting. So part of the post-secular picture, I think, is that within the growing non-Christian religious communities, and actually some of the non-Church of England Christian communities, there are a lot of young people finding new forms of religious expression, but it's more the kind of mainstream Christian culture where their young people are secularizing. So how this is going to play out in terms of how the next generation think about religion in the public sphere be very interesting. Thank you.
No.
Yeah, great.
Thank you for this really great presentation. My name is Jonathan. I'm a visiting researcher at CRCS, and also
great.
With leads and religious studies.
Great.
And I wanted to ask about the kind of challenges of pluralism within the Church of England, particularly the kind of global expression of the Anglican Church that has been happening over the last few years.
Right, yeah.
And in what extent maybe that is affecting the idea of pluralism in the church, and how it also affects society or government as well. There's a lot of issues, but just two that you can pick what you want to address. One of them is about the recent blessing of same-sex marriages that was accepted in the British or English Anglican Church and is now being debated in the global church. And another one is about the kind of racial and colonial reckoning over the past few years and how that has been addressed within the church, but then also in terms of the relationship between Charles as the head of the church, but also the head of the Commonwealth, and how that relates to different countries which are connected to the British monarchy, both through the Anglican Church, because the church is there, but also through the monarch and the Commonwealth. So that's a lot. You don't address all of it.
There is a lot in that.
Thank you.
No, thank you. I mean, I think we're realizing that in our times, in the age in which we live now, trying to hold together any kind of genuinely global network is very, very difficult, because we're seeing, because quite often these organizations operated on either, the general assumption of shared values, which were usually Western values, and sort of nobody asked what other people thought, or voices from particularly the global South just sort of simply weren't listened to, just kind of weren't really taken seriously. So we're now in an age where those voices are gaining in confidence and gaining in number, and certainly in terms of the Church of England and the Anglican Communion, the vast number of Anglicans are in sub-Saharan Africa, and they're very, very different cultural values to most people sitting in English churches on a Sunday, whose values on the whole tend to lean left. I mean, it depends on the issue you pick, but the Church of England is kind of quite a progressive church. So just last week, the Church of England voted to approve the blessing of same-sex civil marriages in church, not to allow same-sex marriages to take place in church. That was a kind of what was viewed as a holding together of traditional Christian teaching about marriage with openness to more progressive culture and so forth. And that's going to have huge ructions among particularly African, but other Anglican Communion churches that simply see that as compromising Christian values, Christian teaching, Christian culture, and everything. And that's what we live with, within the Anglican Communion. I think one of the things that makes me sad about is that it kind of, and these fault lines run right through the Church of England itself, and the more conservative voices have grown in influence for various reasons that we've got time to go into now over the last few years. And so what that means is the Church of England has spent an increasing amount of time talking about its own politics and kind of how it holds itself together and how it holds the Anglican Communion together, and a little bit less time doing the stuff that I really care about, that I've been talking about here, which is kind of, well, how do we serve the society better? How do we serve the world better? And that always seems to me to be the sign of institutions in decline, when they're more concerned about how they kind of maintain their own existence rather than think about what they can do for the world. So I hope we'll jog along, and that we can kind of make the Anglican Communion work, not least because the Anglican Communion is not the only global network that's under huge strain because of diverse cultural values and moral values. And we need more of these kinds of organizations that try to connect people across the planet, and that take cultural difference seriously and find something beyond it that unites us. Thank you.
Wow, thank you very much. Applause for
Thank you.
I think one thing that I cannot conclude, but one thing that I got about is that we share issues. I mean, England and Indonesia share a lot of issues, concerns, and work. We both seem to struggle in dealing with the development of our own countries, with the very diverse of people. Become so diverse now. And issues coming up from the diversity because of new encounters that we have that we cannot avoid are coming more and more. And so I think we thank very much for that. We know that we share many things, and so we could work together for that issues. Thank you again very much. Thank you from, oh, I forgot actually to introduce Professor James Walters from London School of Economics Department of International Relations. And so we have, I mean, we are so glad to have them here. We are going to also with Chris Chaplin. Chris Chaplin is our doing research as a research visiting researcher at the ICIS. And so he will be also with us here to share more, to discuss more about these issues that we have. We thank you again for your coming, for your participation, the presence here to make our Wednesday Forum live. We wait for you for the next Wednesday Forum next week. We will announce you about what's going on next week. Look up our social media in the website. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We have this tradition. It's not the crown, but tradition of
The picture one.
yeah.
Wonderful.
That we share just to show how much we like it, how much we appreciate.
And is the designer here?
Yeah. Raise your hand, please. Who is the designer of
It's amazing. Wonderful. Beautiful. Thank you.
the other citizens of another
She wants us to come into the center, I think. Where do you want us?
can we go to the
Yep.
and so
Thank you.
also thank you very much. Oke, gimana cara? Dan Ripka? Sudah Ripka? Okay, good. Okay. Thank you.
That's
again.
wonderful. Thank you.
He requested like we take pictures from here and send it. So we do it, we do it like here and you. And so the behind.
Great to see. Here we are.
Tangannya apa?